So, what a year it's been. I'm going to quickly go through the good, the bad, and the ugly. A lesson from a year of trial LTNs. 12 minutes on the clock. So there's been so much that's happening in the past year, like, from kind of a real car-free day for a month during the first lockdown to gear change, some incredible campaigns. The kind of Kensington High Street one really stands out for me. Record cycling numbers, amazing stories and campaigns, lots and lots of evidence. But today I'm going to focus on LTNs because they're, I think, the kind of what has stolen the headlines for the past year. And I'm going to focus on some kind of infrastructure, very design-focused lessons learned from the past year. So some statistics from the Active Trial Academy, just showing how many active low traffic neighborhoods have been implemented in London. Almost 4% of Londoners live in a new LTN, which is a staggering amount, and how many live within reach of a new filter. And for me, it was quite nice, like obviously being from Sustrans, seeing the quiet ways finally become quiet, and I guess was the original intention of the program. But we've made a lot of mistakes along the way, and today's presentation really does focus on a lot of those mistakes in terms of sharing some lessons and hopefully helping others in the future. Positive mistake there with the road ahead closed expect cycles, and not so positive one on the left with obviously issues with emergency vehicle access. One that I want to focus on a little bit to start with is the idea of where do we start with LTNs. And I know lots of boroughs and lots of campaigners have sort of questioned this in the past, and the trap of the idea of starting where there's local support, and kind of how that in a perverse way has kind of backfired, and sort of some of the boroughs that maybe did start in the more affluent areas, obviously it was picked up by campaigners, which I think rightly point out that if these are social justice interventions, you can't just start where more affluent areas. I think that we've learned a lot about how to design LTNs, and we kind of learned the hard way of, you really need to make these very comprehensively designed schemes if you want them to work. And that means kind of restricting car use in substantial ways and making sure that traffic stays on those boundary roads, which are all important. Some lessons learned from, I think, boroughs that maybe got it a little bit wrong. I think Lewisham, in their scheme, they defined the boundary as this railway line, kind of going to the southwest of the scheme. Obviously, the issue is that a railway line cannot take that through traffic. So it de facto displaced it onto Hither Green Lane, which I'm sort of hovering my mouse over, which became the de facto boundary road of the LTN, and so substantially increased in traffic. And sort of, it was a real shame, and I think it was part of the kind of downfall of this LTN, when in reality, if they'd done sort of a traffic cell that was based on boundary roads taking traffic, that maybe would have reduced slightly the pushback. Questions about LTNs being too big or too small. I think it's something that we see kind of a range of LTNs being implemented across the capital, and I think there's considerations about land use densities, there's consideration about different facilities and amenities, about access to public transport, but I think there's definitely the perception by some boroughs that an LTN has been successful if I haven't had many complaints, and I really kind of want to challenge that and actually identifying objective measures from success that are independent of the amount of pushback or support that you get, and actually focusing on data and mode shift as a way to achieve success. Banned turns have been a real pain in the arse this year to implement LTNs, and this is a call to every campaigner who's ever campaigned for banning turns. I did that myself, and now it's coming back and backfiring when you're trying to infuse low traffic neighborhoods. And banned turns, particularly at junctions of two major roads, make it really difficult to then implement a low traffic neighborhood. And you can see some data here from the LTN trial in St. Peter's, where because of a banned turn, a residential street has had almost a doubling in traffic, which is obviously not ideal. So yeah, I guess my point about historical banned turn fixes, which are now delaying or preventing LTN implementations. I've had this from a number of boroughs. For example, here in Enfield, where there's a banned turn here at the junction up here, which is making this LTN very difficult, and similarly a couple of schemes in Islington. A lesson we learned the hard way is don't leave leaks in your low traffic neighborhood. There's always the perception of like, oh, is this route really going to get used by through traffic? And I think Lambeth learned the hard way. This is an example of, what was never a rat run and what was never perceived to be a rat run until Waze decided it would be a rat run. So obviously I think the need to kind of make sure that you're low traffic neighborhoods are almost bulletproof in preventing any kind of through journeys. It's just horrendous. Yeah, making sure that they're kind of as impermeable to through traffic as can be. We learned the hard way the need to engage meaningfully, and I think a lot of us were sat here a year ago saying, where's the action, let's get on with it. And I think it's great, campaigners need to push that, but I think it's also important not to forget about people who can be left behind in these conversations, and about the need to actually go to people, to go to speak to people and put in, I think, ultimately the funding. I think that we talk about people that are hard to reach. They're only hard to reach if you don't put in the capital and resources to go and reach them. So I think things like translation services, things like accessibility, I thought the Pave the Way report was great. I think actually the best thing was just seeing in how many formats they published it. And it was kind of, I mean, for me, it was quite a humbling moment of being, I've only ever published a report in a way that I can read it, not other people can read it. And I think that's a lesson for all of us. The need to engage on the ground was also very telling for me. These are some examples from Redbridge, where we delivered a short-lived LTN trial, but just how much, you know, you can put all the stuff you want through the letterbox, but it's only when you go out and mark where the planters go on the road that the people come out the front door and they say, what are you doing? And that's when inevitably you realize that, you know, that disabled bay, for example, needs an extra 3 meters at the back for the wheelchair user to load. And so that's when you can tweak your designs. And I really urge people to kind of get on the ground, chat to people when you're implementing your trials, because that's the only way you're actually going to mitigate the issues. We obviously learned this one the hard way as well, the need to build from building line to building line, not just from curb line to curb line. This was quite an early lesson in the implementation, but it's amazing still how many boroughs get this wrong. Satellite navigation has also been a really tough, steep learning curve, I think. People just seem to believe their phones more than their eyes. If they get to a planter and their phone tells them they can drive through, they will drive through. And so the real need to engage early with all the various mapping providers. It's a good story about this from St. Peter's, where the filters went in on Waze before they went in real life. And overnight, all the Ubers just vanished. It was like a virtual LTN. It was wonderful. You can never have enough signs. I think this is another lesson that we learned this year. Just, you know, you can just put every sign you can, and then people will still complain about them. So don't take criticism don't take requests for more signs as a criticism, but definitely put as many as you can. I think the other point for me is that it should look like a filter. And I think compliance has been an issue in this past year, and it's a real easy win if we do it properly. But you can see the filter, this picture on the left, this is a filter. I think we can hardly blame someone from driving through there. Yes, there are signs, but I think if you can make it look a bit more like a filter, obviously ideally planters across, but even this in Islington, where they've kept a route through for emergency vehicles, but as you approach it on the right side of the road, it tells you at least look up and have a think, and that will just make life easier for everyone. A lesson I learned the hard way was about not stopping halfway. This is the story from Redbridge, where we kind of implemented some of the filters, and then some of the politicians got slightly, you know, they were a little bit, well, they weren't so sure, and they asked us to pause the implementation, which left effectively like half a low traffic neighborhood, which, as we all know, doesn't really work, because all you're doing is then displacing traffic to a few of the streets. And that ultimately led to, I think, the downfall of this trial. But I would really say, if you need to change anything, just delay the whole implementation rather than implementing part of it. Physical versus camera enforcement is another one that I think we've all engaged with. I'm not even going to touch on exemptions, because I hope we all agree on that one. But the need to engage with emergency services early. I think you can see the boroughs that have done this properly, and they've implemented many more physically enforced filters. I think Southwark, Waltham Forest are the ones that stand out, while others that have had to rely much more on camera enforcement. And it's just a very different environment. And as I always say, you can't play cricket in front of a camera. Another one that I think is really important is the need to have filters, not just that block traffic, but that activate streets. And there's some really good examples here from Southwark and Lewisham, who, with very cheap interventions, all of a sudden a modal filter isn't just something in the way of people, but it's actually something that attracts people. And this is something I think we need to do a lot more of. And some pictures here as well, some more from Southwark. And activating the street, even with events and with street painting, with putting benches. I think anything we can do to actually bring life out onto the streets, not just so that we can see the positive, not just the negatives. And some painting days as well here from Tower Hamlets. Another point for me is about enabling the mode shift and thinking, I think we do focus a lot on infrastructure, and infrastructure is an essential step, but I think we also can't forget the other things, the other barriers that people face, particularly people that aren't like us from cycling. We all think, you know, if you put infrastructure, people will cycle because that's what we do, but actually the need for behavior change programs. And I think it's easy to forget Waltham Forest's success. You know, yes, lots of LTNs, yes, lots of cycle tracks, £30 million program of behavior change, of comms, of cycle hangers, bike parking, of cycle training, specifically targeting certain demographics. And I think it's really important that we also place emphasis on those. This is a bit of a, I mean, it's funny to think a year ago we were here kind of widening footways in front of stations, thinking we'd go straight back to the office. And it still looks a little bit funny when you go into the city and you see all these widened footways. So I think we maybe were a little bit unaware of the long-term changes in travel plans. And I think there's still a bit to think about whether we've delivered in the right areas. There's been a lot of delivery in central London when actually many people haven't gone into central London for a year and won't have seen these changes. A lot of people are living a lot more locally in the suburban areas, and I don't think we've changed those areas of London as much as we could have. And actually, you can see kind of the traffic patterns, people just living a lot more in outer London. And I think there's a question related to this about, you know, how have we come out of the pandemic? It's great. I think there's been lots of improvements in central London, but have we just magnified inequalities? Is active travel in Cardiff City even a bigger postcode lottery? I think, you know, if you're living in one of the lucky boroughs in the Islingtons, the Camdens, the Lamberts, who are doing pretty well already, now they're doing even better. But if you're living in the, well, Harrows, the Bexleys, then I think you're even further away from considering active travel. And I guess the provocative question at the end is, are we any closer to the 80% Mayor's transport strategy target? And I think it's really important not to forget about these outer London boroughs. This is the potentially cyclable trips, just how many are in outer London, and a real need to focus on helping those boroughs out in the outer London boroughs where really radical transformation can happen. And this is kind of the last slide, kind of, you know, boroughs that haven't really done anything are facing this. They are facing car-led recovery and will continue doing so. Well, the boroughs that already had a lot and already had kind of good public transport, they also have quieter streets, which is great, but are we really achieving the kind of transformative mode shift we need away from the private car, or are we just getting people out of public transport onto walking and cycling? So that's it. I think I maybe overran by 1 minute.
Right. Let me give you a bit of background to active travel, specifically in Cardiff, but also more generally in Wales. We've got a couple of bits of legislation passed by the Welsh Assembly, the Active Travel Act and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which potentially are a boon to active travel. Like many governments, the Welsh Assembly passed a climate emergency, declared a climate emergency back in 2019. More recently, they published their Wales Transport Strategy, which they're calling a new path, which, whilst not perfect, it clearly prioritises active travel and public transport over the use of private motor vehicles. And after what feels like a lengthy drought of funding, we're finally getting close to some decent dedicated active travel funding, which I think for this year is between 70 and 75 million across Wales. Cardiff specifically, this is stuff that's happening right now or has gone in just in the last 2 years. We've had a new Next Bike hire scheme, which really took off. They were doing big numbers of hires early on in that scheme. Cardiff Council seized on the pandemic and stuck in a couple of pop-up routes, which I think will become permanent. That funding, which I mentioned, that will contribute to 5 cycleways, cycle superhighways, segregated routes across the city, connecting the city and the bay and various communities. Wales, I think, increasingly has a default urban speed limit 20 miles per hour, and lots of Cardiff now is already 20 miles an hour, which is great. Within the last couple of years, we've had our first LTN, and probably in the last 18 months, we've had a small school streets pilot by the council, which ballooned, and I think a lot of those will become permanent. Right then, the future. So Cardiff Council at the local level, just in the last year, they've published a transport white paper. It's part plan, part discussion document, but there's some really positive stuff in there talking about upping train capacity, new metro, and there's already spades in the ground for that. The new segregated cycleways, which I've talked about, and laying the foundation possibly for congestion charging coming into the city. The council on the hook with the Welsh Assembly to update an active travel network map. They have to do that every 3 years under the Welsh Assembly. The next iteration of that is due December this year after a public commonplace consultation earlier this year. So we shall await that with bated breath. I'm ending on a couple of notes of caution. There is a lot of social media and lobbying noise from the vocal minority car users in the city about the changes that are planned and are already going in. And also in May, I think when you folks in England have local elections, like Scotland, we've got national general elections for the Senate. So if that changes the makeup, I don't know whether the attitude to active travel will stay the same or improve or get worse. Wish us luck. Thank you.
So young women taking over the road on Bishy Road, and this is the one on the left is Helau, which is a little village about 5 miles out of York. There's about 12 people cycling there. York hit the ground running. This scheme was already in. There was some road works on the bridge just where the bus is, and they left the traffic cones in, so they created a pop-up cycle lane. There was some on the other side where the bus was, but they took those out. But unfortunately, this didn't stay in too long. Only 30 cyclists an hour using it. People in West Yorkshire would think that's a lot of cyclists. It's not for York, so they took it out, unfortunately. Bishopthorpe Road was another one. The road was made one way, but two way for bikes, with footways widened rather uglily, I think. That was taken out, unfortunately, but it's hopefully something widen footways will happen there in the future. Tadcaster Road, near where I live, road resurfacing, got onto the local council. Can we get some cycle lanes with protection back in? There used to be lanes in there. They put in slightly wider lanes, unfortunately, with no protection, and the gas board have just dug it up. So that was a missed opportunity. This one's a good one, Marygate Car Park, with 70 parking spaces taken out at the edge of the car park to avoid the narrow pathway down the side of, this is NCN 658 from the National Cycle Network, and that scheme is now being made permanent, so they're going to make that permanent. The roadworks have just started. Coppergate road closed for just all traffic apart from buses, which can go one way, cyclists can go two way. Some very narrow ones, contraflow at the end. Some of them have been damaged, probably hit by a bus coming the other way, but that's a good cross-town route. This one I put on Twitter. This is our big sort of protected bike lane active travel fund tranche 2 scheme. These are the widths of the lanes, 1.4, 1.5, and lots of traffic lane width, but the council officers don't think it's wide enough to put protected spaces in. Discuss. And then we've got one LTN in the Groves. This happened before lockdown, but it went in during lockdown and got caught up with all the lockdown sort of discussion, but it settled down. My friend Stuart lives just to the side there where it's very, very quiet. We play music in his garden in the afternoon. Just finish on parking. Railway station, these used to be full when I commuted to Leeds. They're empty now, sadly. But the university has put in some rather brightly coloured toast racks. In about 7 bike spaces, you can get about 80 or 70 or 80 cycles in, and hopefully they will start using them shortly. So that's York Whistle Stop Tour. Some good things that have stayed in, some have been taken out, and we're still waiting for our big scheme, and hopefully that'll happen soon.
So I'm going to take you further north to North Tyneside, local authority next to Newcastle along the east coast. The council announced the first tranche of emergency active travel schemes in June last year, so quite early compared to some other local authorities, and they showed significant road space reallocation, which was great. We had a new 2-way pop-up cycleway about 4 kilometers long along the seafront, which is also an NTN route, renamed Sunrise Cycleway by the locals. with motorized traffic reduced to 1 lane. And they've also announced initially 3 pedestrian and cycling zones in town centres. The council used experimental orders, which strangely enough had a 6 months duration only. Quickly though, one high street was dropped and another one reduced to Saturdays only, that was Parkview. All measures were removed after 4 months without any evaluation monitoring report, despite traffic data having been collected, a large volume of feedback having been submitted through the Sustrans Space to Move online portal petition, more than 5,000 people, and by email to the council. So to summarize, we had a great start and now we're pretty much back to square one. Not particularly optimistic about tranche 2, as the promised consultation at the end of March did not happen. One thing to stress in terms of the benefit of the cycleways, it created a better and safer environment for pedestrians. So no conflicts with cyclists on the promenade, and also quite a seafront for local residents and visitors, with evidence of reduced motorized traffic speed, which is interesting. So they go well beyond the increase of cycling trips that we saw. So we had about 1,500 trips on a Saturday or Sunday, and a much more diverse range of people on bike, as you would expect. The council is committed to install a permanent cycleway next year, while maintaining the 2-way motorized traffic, which we know is not possible because some of the sections are extremely narrow. So we now expect a flurry of consultations after the elections, and the big question mark is about political will. The political will to do actually anything, a lot more than what they've done or kept, and better. And other thing to watch is the quality of design. On the more positive side, the council also introduced 4 school streets, the first ones in the region, through an 18-month experimental order that started at the end of February. And also I'd like to give a big shout to our North Tyneside Play Street group, which is the 3rd most active group in England after Bristol and Hackney. So that's credit to the fantastic Alison Stenning. I think you know, some of you know her. Finally, another positive thing that we saw, the same way we saw a lot more people taking up cycling and walking during the first lockdown. The short-term measures created a lot of interest and support, with many local residents starting for the first time campaigning for active travel and people-friendly streetscape. So we had local residents and shop owners as well organizing street events and busking during the car-free Saturdays on Parkview, which is really lovely. And we also have local artists promoting the new high street and the Sunrise Cycleway. And we now a new Living Streets local group. So watch this space, it's just the beginning.
So I'm going to update on Newcastle's emergency active travel schemes. And I'm just sharing a post from our campaign website, which I can put in the chat. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but I'm going to talk about why I think that the approach in Newcastle has been successful. And so Newcastle received just over £500,000 from the first round of the government's Active Travel Fund, and they supplemented this with around twice as much again from their local transport plan funding. And they took 3 main approaches over the last year. First was city centre schemes, the second neighbourhood filtering schemes, and the first started off as local shopping streets. So the first city centre scheme was here on Queen Victoria Road, and it was initially constructed as a bi-directional track on the same side as the Royal Victoria Infirmary, which you can see in the distance there. And it replaced some parking. It's since been changed to with flow lanes, and the council are now consulting on a permanent scheme, which is going to be a bi-directional track on the Newcastle University side of the road, the other side. So the final scheme also proposes to remove a mini roundabout and replace it with direct crossings for walking and cycling. And the second city centre scheme was Grace Street, and this involved the removal of substantial amounts of parking and replacing this with additional pavement space and an uphill protected cycle route. And they have announced that the aim is to fully pedestrianise this street. So the neighbourhood filtering schemes involve closing 5 small bridges in the neighbourhoods in the east of the city. And through this, there are now 3 low traffic neighbourhoods which have been created. These are all being consulted, well, have been consulted on, and a final decision about whether they'll be made permanent will be made later in the year. And that's these bridges here. And then finally, there were some temporary measures on local shopping streets. And some of these have been adjusted, some of them have been removed where they haven't worked. This is one which is still here. But significantly, none of the additional cycling space implemented since the summer last year has been removed so far.
Yay.
So the 4 reasons that we think the Newcastle approach has been successful is that the aims of the schemes were really well communicated, and they were linked to both COVID response and the Council's climate net zero policy. And there was a really clearly stated intention to retain the measures where they worked. The schemes were ambitious, but they weren't over ambitious, and so they were easier to defend, and I think resources weren't stretched so thinly. They had strong support from the leader of the council, Nick Forbes, Cabinet Member for Transport, Arlene Ainsley, and other Cabinet members, such as the Cabinet Member for Climate Change and Communities. And I think that's really helped kind of people feel more confident about speaking out in support of them. And adjustments were made finally when things didn't work, and the councils kept lines of communication open with people who both supported and objected to the schemes. And I think all of this has made it easier for us to get people to support the schemes. There has been a backlash mainly against the closure of the bridges, although the cycleways aren't universally popular. But the really wonderful thing is to be seeing so many people using them. And I first spoke on Ideas with Beers early on last year, and I talked about how many people were cycling because the traffic had gone. And definitely not everyone is still cycling, but there are a lot more people cycling, I think, than were before. And a lot of people are using these new schemes and much of the other new infrastructure the council's built over the last few years. Very good. Well, I'm pretty much done. I was just going to say, looking forward to the future. We're looking forward to them launching school streets next year, and we'd really like to see now more cycling space claimed on some of the main roads.
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Brian, for inviting me to do this. This is great to have the first year anniversary as an opportunity to look forward, and just kind of reflect what an amazing year this has been for cycling walking policy. Now, I kind of reflected at the end of 2020 that whatever else had happened in the wider world, Donald Trump being awful, Bolsonaro, Putin, black people being killed by police officers in the States, all wildfires in Siberia. As long as I kept my blinkers on, my day job blinkers on, thinking just about cycling walking policy, 2020 was actually a really rather good year. So just keep the blinkers on. That was really what I like. Okay, so how do I? Right. So it's hard to. Are you seeing this chat on my screen as well, or are you just seeing the slides? That's good.
No, we're just seeing the slides. We're all good.
Good. All right. Okay, so it's kind of weird to think back that when we first got thrown into lockdown, our immediate priorities were really defensive, to persuade the government that among all the things that they were closing down, the bike shops should be kept open. They were going to be essential services for key workers, and indeed for people who are going to need to take up exercise. And of course, to prevent cycling actually being banned. The Spanish government had banned cycling on the grounds that, we can't have more people going into hospital than are already going in with COVID for who people got cycling injuries. So it was actually quite a relief when the government bought the idea that they needed to positively promote cycling and walking as ways for people to get around for those key workers who were still traveling to work, and so on, and doing all sorts of fundraising to enable key workers to buy bikes or refurbish bikes, lots of fundraising to support key workers, obviously in the time when we were clapping for carers and all that stuff. It's really quite extraordinary to think back what was happening in those early days and how far things have moved on in the meantime. First point where we really started to get proactive and kind of feeling that rather than being on the back foot, we were kind of getting onto the front foot, was when we realized there was this opportunity with the streets empty, pretty empty of motor vehicle traffic, to put in this what would came to be known as pop-up cycle lanes and the widened pavements and everything that we've all been talking about over the past year. That there was opportunity to put some stuff in that hopefully we thought would get really well used so that nobody would ever dream of wanting to take it out again. And of course, that dream has come partly true and partly untrue, as we all know. But you know, one of the first things the Department of Transport did proactively on this, at Cycling UK's instigation, was to commission Robin Lovelace of Leeds University of the Propensity to Cycle tool fame to create this rapid tool to enable people to nominate places where pop-up cycle lanes could go, where there was enough road width that a lane could be taken out for temporary cycle infrastructure, experimental cycle infrastructure, and the nominations came flooding in. Now, in the first obvious sign of backlash, this whole idea of pop-up cycle lanes got dismissed by the Conservative leader of Lancashire County Council, the appropriately named Jeff Driver, as childish antics. Well, by early May, the government of his party was issuing statutory guidance requiring local authorities to consider these childish antics. And sure enough, Lancashire County Council did indeed put in some childish antics. So this was a really nice little early win. It was at the same time that the government issued that statutory guidance. Why is my next slide not coming up? Is this the usual slow changeover happening? Here we go. Right. The Secretary of State, you remember all those daily COVID briefings at Number 10, where different government ministers popped up every day to kind of announce the latest news and then make some announcements. And Grant Shapps was incredibly keen to, make announcements. He was constantly sort of asking his officials, please give me something to announce. So on the 9th of May, he got to announce at the Number 10 briefing that 2 billion would be made available for cycling and walking over the next 5 years. This wasn't entirely new funding. It had been previously announced by the Prime Minister back in February that there'd be 5 billion for cycling and buses. We now knew that 2 billion of that was to be for active travel. This is the first time really in the time I've been doing this job that active travel funding has finally kind of got into the right ballpark. It's still a quarter to a third of what is needed to meet the government's own targets. And of course, the government's own targets to double cycling would still only get us to less than 4% of trips being made by cycling by 2025. So we've got a hell of a long way to go, but we're finally getting into something vaguely like the right ballpark. It's about 5, actually should have said 6 times more than the previous 5 years. Central government budget for cycling walking is 80 times more than we got in 2005, which was sort of a couple of years after I started doing this job. So, for those of us who are inclined to think nothing ever changes, actually we have made some progress over those sort of timescales. Then Grant Shapps' next opportunity to do a Number 10 briefing, he gave us the breakdown of what the first year of that 2 billion was going to be: 220 the Emergency Active Travel Fund and 25 million for cycle repair vouchers. Unfortunately for Grant Shapps, that was also the day on which the news story broke about Cummings making his trip to Barnard Castle. So the media weren't interested in asking him about the funding for cycle repair vouchers. They just wanted to ask him about something else together. You sort of almost feel sorry for Grant Shapps in circumstances like that. Anyway, it was very good news for cycling, but we still need more good news, and we keep pushing for it. The next really big day was the 28th of July, which I would simply describe as the most important day there's been in the history of cycling policy in the UK. 3 major things happened that day, and one other little also ran thing that I had to do that morning. That was the day on which the government issued its gear change vision document, which was basically had all the policy commitments that we'd have ever wished it, apart from the funding, of course, but in every other respect, it was basically cycling walking policy looking really good. And it was accompanied by the cycling infrastructure design guidance that we're all aware of, the local transport note LTN 120, massive improvement on its predecessor, the local transport note 208 from 12 years previously, and a highway code review. So that too was, the previous highway code review had taken place in 2006, 2007. We at Cycling UK had campaigned at that time. We got 40 rule changes, but there were a whole load more rule changes that we still wanted, and we've been making the noise about this really fairly consistently for several years. we finally got them into the government's consultation draft, having had a lot of conversations beforehand with the motoring groups, with disability groups, the freight groups, in order to reassure the government that if they took on board our proposals, and when I say our proposals, this was the Cycling Walking Alliance working together, so us and Living Streets and British Cycling in particular, went and met all of those organisations and were able to go back to DFT and say, here's our proposals, and we've talked to all those other groups to reassure them that they won't throw massive spanners in the works. So the consultation proposals came out pretty much as we'd wanted them, and we were able to mobilise 16,000 people in support of what the government by this stage had now put forward, but it was basically what we asked them to put forward. And that morning, on the morning that all those three things happened, I also had to submit our petition, give oral evidence to a Lords committee that was scrutinising our petition on the HS2 bill. That too has been a hugely long-running battle. HS2 have been incredibly resistant to taking on board the cycling infrastructure design guidance, even the old design guidance. Well, our petition was due to be heard on the very day that the new design guidance came out. So we were able to put HS2 on the back foot, and they have now moved in the meantime. So there's another little quiet sign of progress going on in the background. Right, so we then started to see the backlash begin in earnest. The Daily Telegraph really started targeting Grant Shapps, whereas the Daily Mail started targeting Sadiq Khan and talked much more about what was going on in London. But that's possibly due to the fact that the Daily Mail's office, that Lord Rothermere, the proprietor of the Daily Mail, couldn't get his limo nice and easily to the Daily Mail's office, which are just off Kensington High Street. So the Daily Mail was carrying articles from Nigel Havers, who just happened to have met Lord Rothermere at a party a week before that article got printed, about how Kensington High Street used to be a lovely place with clean air, in more senses than one. So we got Kensington Chelsea starting to threaten to rip out those cycle lanes, as did West Sussex and, of course, North Tyneside and others. So several London boroughs ripping out low traffic neighbourhoods, in some cases with justification, in some cases with absolutely no justification whatsoever. So the local group in Kensington Chelsea, Better Streets for Kensington Chelsea, fantastic local group, got legal advice and absolutely nailed it with the legal challenge that they threatened to take, which forced Kensington Chelsea to back down and reconsider their decision. But then they reconsidered it and didn't actually really change their mind. So that one's still live. Meanwhile, we issued a challenge against West Sussex's equally unevidence-based removal of the cycle lane that I showed you in the cover slide to this at the start of this presentation, the one on the Upper Shoreham Road. That legal challenge is still ongoing. We're expecting an oral hearing, a first oral hearing, sometime in mid-May. I will keep you posted. Of course, the taxi drivers were also challenging the London Street Space Scheme. Interestingly, the legal arguments, some of the legal arguments, are being used by both sides, particularly the Equality Act. So the taxi drivers were saying that Transport for London had failed to consider its Equality Act to think about the needs of people with disabilities to use taxis to get to Liverpool Street Station. We are saying, and Better Streets for Kensington Chelsea was saying, that there are respective, the Kensington and West Sussex councils failed to consider their Equality Act duties to consider the needs of children and women, and of course also disabled people who cycle. So the point is the Equality Act can be used on both sides. Local authorities just need to be considering all of their equality duties, not just disabled people. Looking ahead, so that's the sort of live issues. We've basically got cycling and walking policy in England to a very healthy place, so long as you don't look at the wider transport policy or wider land use policy and all the other bits of government, which still need to come good. So I'm sort of thinking that the year ahead is going to be about broadening out beyond cycling walking policy, but we still need to make sure that the details of gear change get put in, particularly setting up Active Travel England. There are huge debates between number 10, the Treasury and DFT as to how much funding will be available for Active Travel England itself, to make sure, is it going to be strong enough to do all the wonderful things that it's supposed to do? checking on good design, checking on that local authorities are integrating the cycling design standards into the planning, into new developments as well as new traffic schemes. Are we going to get the Part 6 of the Traffic Management Act finally implemented, so the local authorities outside London can finally implement school street schemes? Those issues are still dragging, well, the government is still dragging their heels on both of those issues, and there's plenty more in gear change that we still need delivered. But looking at the broader picture, well, this morning the government committed to agree the climate change targets proposed by its statutory advisor, the Committee on Climate Change. Will that mean that its forthcoming transport decarbonisation plan actually commits to traffic reduction targets, or will it still rely on electric vehicles? We will be mounting pressure on that one. Of course, the spending review is crucial for making sure that the second cycling and walking investment strategy, CWIS 2, is adequately funded. Can we actually get to the 6 to 8 billion that we believe is needed? And can we get the report that the DFT published and is still sitting on, which says, we're pretty sure it says, that 6 to 8 billion is what is needed to meet the government's targets? Can we finally get them to publish that report in order to really have the evidence base before the Treasury unveils its spending review later this year, and before DFT then goes on and allocates the funding, whatever funding it's got by then, to cycling and walking for the next 5 years? Can we make sure that the government's planning reforms, as outlined in its planning white paper, really support cycle and pedestrian friendly development rather than car dependent developments? That too is very much of a live issue. One that's been missed is in the police bill, the one that's generated all the noise about criminalising protests, criminalising unauthorised encampments. The government also decided to chuck in a whole load of legislation that they've been talking about for years and years and years, and which they were saying they were going to produce in the autumn. And then suddenly they chucked it into this police bill. I suspect it was mainly to make sure that the Labour Party that supported a load of these changes had to vote against some stuff that they were in favour of. Just to kind of, this is just playground politics, frankly. But it means that we've now got to do a lot of work in double quick time to make sure that there is support for the wider range of road traffic offences, clarifying the distinction between careless and dangerous driving, making sure that hit and run offences attract serious penalties, that car dooring, when it causes death or serious injury, attract serious penalties, and so on. There's a whole load of things that the government has just been neglecting. And we're just going to have to try and push for in that bill. And then can we secure the funding opportunity to open up from Brexit? All Michael Gove's promises about public goods for public subsidies, including public access to the countryside, can we secure some of that funding to open up the countryside for off-road cycling and walking and horse riding? So those are some of the things that we're looking at that go beyond the narrow confines in cycling and walking policy, but clearly funding is still the real big one. Jeff, I seem to have missed a slide, sorry. One slide I've jumped.
We're out of time there, Roger.
Sorry?
We're out of time there now.
All right, I was going to do a little review of comparison of cycling, of where we are with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Basically, all of the other 3 nations of the UK are getting some things right. I was going to go through a little 4 nations roundup, but the thing that England is massively behind on Scotland, Wales on is funding. We need to do some catching up. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Roger. We haven't got time for too many questions, but maybe we'll make a bit at the end. But I said I was going to pick my favourite. I'm hoping you're going to answer the rest in the chat now, so I can check them. But yeah, Roxanne, do you want to ask your one? Because I thought that was the best. Or I can ask it for you.
Roger, you had your looking ahead slide with the things that are coming up or we would like to see coming up. I guess for all of us as campaigners, what do you think is the number one, I know it's going to be hard, but number one message or action we should all be focusing on in the coming months to really encourage, is it Active Travel England or the Highway Code Review? What should we be doing and saying to help you with your work to make it happen?
Well, thanks. The first thing is taking advantage of all the local elections we've got coming up. whether it's in Scotland, in Wales, in many of the cities, in every English Shire county, is encourage your candidates to vote bike, vote walk. And many of my campaigns team colleagues have been liaising with, I'm pretty sure with you, and certainly with local campaigners in Scotland and Wales. We've set out manifestos in some of the large cities likewise. So just get the candidates to vote cycling, walking. So we've got that local commitment. But at the national level, we're then going to be mobilizing campaigns to secure some traffic reduction commitments in or after the transport decarbonisation plan. And I really hope that that in turn will set the context for a very different cycling walking investment strategy. That £27 billion road building programme, some of it has got to be reallocated. And if we can really say that transport policy is the big thing that's going in the wrong direction on climate change, that really gives us a leg up to get the 6 to 8 billion funding. Carving some of it off the 27 billion road building programme, that'll be a biggie.
Okay, the quick view from Oxfordshire then. So go quickly through Emergency Active Travel Fund and then some other things. So we had the two rounds. Our first round, the council put in half the money in their bid was for basically veg cutting and line repainting, including this glorious 80 centimetre wide cycle lane near me. We got some new bike racks. They had some good filters that would have really made a difference. Dave trying to cut me off here. Which would have really made a nice difference, but then they were quietly dropped. We did get a good thing in Witney, one of the market towns, where the high street was closed to private motors, and later that yellow sign was changed to one of the nice green ones, and now it's got planters, so it looks a whole lot nicer, and that's really quite nice setup. Emergency Active Travel Fund 2, or just dropping the E, wasn't it? But the campaigning groups proposed a whole set of pop-up cycle lanes. We really put our heads together and came up with some great proposals. The council actually chose something quite different, really a strong focus on LTNs in Oxford, interestingly enough, of which they've now done the first 3. The local groups there got some really good community support, which was fantastic. There have been some pushback. Literally, somebody shoved one of the planters a few yards down the road. They're now bolted down. We got a kind of mix of shared and separated provision in Bristol, which is, it's not great, but it's an improvement. And again, there's similar things in Witney, which have been heavily diluted on implementation, so we're not that excited. And then a couple of other bits of fun. We had a councillor who, if you can read the tweet there, agreed with a rather offensive tweet about cyclists. People would complain if I did the same. We did complain, and he was forced to resign from his cabinet position. Unfortunately, our friend, Councillor Suzanne Bartington, who was the cycling champion and real great supporter of cycling, resigned. She was going to stand down in May anyway, so this was really to make a point. And spoke to the local newspapers about how impossible it was to create positive change. We have also been spending our time doing what I call community Elsie whips, developing our own plans. So here is a quick diagram, partly inspired by these calls. This is a drawing of the one we did in Abingdon. 25 routes, we've got about 40 people to help us, and now they're being done in 4 other towns. And there I shall leave you and shortly be off on my mountain bike up on the Ridgeway.
Okay, I'm just going to look at 3 themes quickly. Building the political will to challenge motor hegemony in a car city. Building the infrastructure. I'll just take you a ride out on the good, the bad, and not so good. A ride out to Longbridge, where Phil Jones Associates is, and where they used to make Austin motor cars. And then a little bit about the politics of building a social movement and moving from space for cycling to walk, cycle, play. motoring campaigners don't have to go to meetings for 10 years to get what they want. Car dominance is built in, it's assumed, it's in our language. Our mayor promised to, quotes, he's a good guy, turbocharge walking and cycling. It's just built in. But now, and that's what I want to say, we have got that precious political will in Birmingham. It's built up over the last 7 years. We had a very good bid to Cycle City Ambition Grant, spent about 70 million from that and associated funds. And that's been a lot of mistakes, a lot of learning. And the leader of Birmingham City Council now talks of the Motor City becoming a cycle city. And a cabinet lead is a local hero, Councillor Wasim Safa, who's championing a radical Birmingham transport plan. And they use that plan, they used that plan as the basis for the EATF and did 2 very good bids. But the plan is great. They're going to gentify, not gentrify the city centre, segregated spoke cycle routes, which we've wanted for some time, and then LTNs in all the suburbs. Right. Now, why isn't it moving?
Want to just click on the left? Click on the...
Click on
Left
slide.
click, yeah. Oh, bugger.
Just put your cursor on slide 2 and it will move down.
Ah, brilliant. Thank you.
Like that.
That's great. Thank you so much. Right, this is a bike ride. One of the few bike rides I've done because I've been shielding. You start off from the city centre on the beautiful new blue route built at the end of the Birmingham Cycling Revolution and the Ambition Grant. It's now a faded denim, but it's a real treat, very high standard. You then go into Selly Oak, and it's taken me 4 goes to work out what's supposed to happen here. This is pop-up, this is EATF, but you got a dual 2-way coming out of the university going up, and then about 100 yards or so, you've got a switch if you're going south, across onto the pavement, past the Aldi, past a bus stop, and you don't get anything other than pavement cycling until you get to the station. Not very good. You then come to the shared bus lane, which is, I think, brilliant. It's a big wide dual carriageway going south of Selly Oak. They gave a bus lane, cycle lane and a taxi lane. It's not good infrastructure. It's not LTM 120, but it's one hell of a quick way of getting stuff done. And it means my rides could be well removed from the cars and not in a narrow painted lane where cars overtaking each other. It's a real treat. They're taking that out. A lot of opposition from motorists who want to overtake each other. But the real classic all the way from Northfield to Longbridge is shared use pavement, which is still endemic across South Birmingham, I'm afraid.
You've got 30 seconds left, David.
Okay, sorry. Right. Campaigning. We had a big bike picnic in 2017, but now we're moving to walk, cycle, play, building new alliances. The LTN side of that is really important. I'll go back to that. Started off a bit raw, now looking really nice. And the alliances are with local residents groups really pushing for LTNs. And we've had 4 seminars. Zoom is brilliant. You don't have to go to boring meetings in cafes or things. Absolutely brilliant. You can meet at 8 o'clock at night so family people can join you. And the other thing is big national alliances. And the people who've been most helpful, to be honest, have been Friends of the Earth, who put us in their climate action plan, which has gone really well. We've talked to all the candidates for mayor, and Action Vision Zero, who've been absolutely superb, highly recommended, campaigning for what's really vital. So wider alliances and then getting more people involved. And if you're a tired old cycle campaigner, that's just wonderful. Thank you.
Hi. I discovered last night I shouldn't be here, despite being here all year, because I'm not a professional active travel expert. I'm just somebody who cycles and spends a lot of time on Twitter. But I've got some information about Leicester, where I live. And as you know, we've only just come out of lockdown 1 in Leicester. We've been locked down for the whole year. This is one of my favourite images. The cones went in very early in Leicester, and this is a 4-year-old cycling happily, not on the pavement, in the cones with her mum behind her. So, some numbers. Can you see these numbers? Is the screen all right for you?
Yep.
I've got these figures from Ride Leicester. I'm part of Leicester City Cycling Group these days, but I wasn't when I started coming on these events. They ran a donation scheme for key workers and have had over 500 bikes donated, some brand new, some dragged out of sheds and rebuilt. 630 fixed for free for key workers. And the cycling levels in Leicester are about the same or a bit above 2019, which, given that we've had a closed city centre for a year because we didn't reopen, is pretty good, I would suggest. When it first started and the first key worker bike lane went in, basically the council used the money that they would have spent advertising a big Sky Ride or City Ride, as it is now with HSBC. They used that budget to pay for the cones, which they dragged out of the depot. And we had money from that. And then they got about 500,000, 400,000 for EATF1 and 1.38 million in round two, tranche two, which compares with the county, which is much bigger in area, who only got 335,000 in round one and 900,000 in round two. So serious money. They've used the cargo bikes that the council have bought over time, supporting food banks, doing deliveries to people's houses, and library books. So one bike has got the clean books and one bike's got the dirty books that brings back from a COVID household. I'm being attacked by the dog, who's also attacking the people. Me. This
Got 20 seconds left, Tim.
Okay, so my favourite image, this chap has no legs, but he's running a pop-up cycle lane. 11 miles went in 10 weeks, and they're still there. They're still there today. They've used the Transforming Cities Fund for big, permanent, segregated lanes and super crossings, and they launched a docked e-bike scheme in February, which you don't do, aimed at key workers, and that's now gone citywide. Anybody can get involved in that now. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed Ideas with Beers. I've learned a lot this year. Thank you.
Right, thanks everyone. Worcester's a cathedral city with a population of about 100,000. It's got the M5 running down on the east and the River Severn running through the sort of off-centred middle. It's a single bridge city with all the associated traffic problems that brings. It also has a terrible council which doesn't really support cycling. That said, it's got 2 fine pedestrian cycle bridges over the Severn, and there's a third one being planned. The current infrastructure project is the dualling of the bypass, including the widening of the bridge, the current bridge over the River Severn on the bypass. My personal feeling is with 4 roundabouts in 3 kilometres, it will just move the queue quicker to the end. To get the national funding which was required for that bypass, it had to build 3 wonderful active travel bridges at the cost of several £1 million each. While these are good, it has to be said that the cycle routes tend to peter out once you cross those bridges. For my part, I've been trying to get a cycleway, or I'm trying to get a cycleway on a 1.5 kilometre stretch of a wide road connecting the largest satellite, you can see at the top there of the screen, which has 3,000 people, to the largest industrial and retail site in Worcester. Because of the antagonistic relationship between the council and various lobby groups, I'm trying to do this on my own. So far, it remains to be seen if something happens. Warm words from the cabinet member for transport, and we've got 2 lowered curbs, but we'll see what happens later. Worcester's well endowed with cycle routes, although not particularly connected and few linking to the centre. It has got quite, for many cities, it's actually got quite a lot of sort of cycles infrastructure. It also has plenty of low traffic neighbourhoods, both in the, it really doesn't need low traffic neighbourhoods, both in the post-60s developments which surround Worcester, and also in the earlier Victorian terraces, thanks to geographical constraints. The real issue about Worcester and its traffic are the boundary roads, and they're not rat runs. So really, I think, you know, what we need here is a low traffic town, not a low traffic neighborhood. And if you think this problem just applies to Worcester, if we look at the population of the top 100 cities in Britain, we've got London in blue, we've got Newcastle, Manchester, and everything else in the biggies in orange. But over nearly 60 cities are sort of similar size to Worcester. So I really think that, and as you can see, it's got a significant population if you add those together. So that's it. Thank you.
Right, I'm going to tell you what's happening here through the mechanism of sharing the manifesto that Walk Ride Greater Manchester, of which I'm part, and other campaign groups have worked on together. So I'm going to talk you through our 10-point manifesto, the reality now, and what Andy Burnham has promised in his manifesto, which came out last week. So the top...
Charles, you just want to stop sharing? Sorry, Claire, to interrupt you. Just we've still got Charles' slides up. I don't know whether you're trying to share, Claire.
Yeah, I am, yeah.
Charles, let me stop sharing this then.
You might have to boot him off, boot the share off. There we go.
There we go.
Right.
Yeah, good to go now, Claire. We'll start your time again, all right?
So yeah, I'm going to tell you where we're up to through the mechanism of sharing our manifesto that we came up with as a campaign group with other campaign groups, echoing the point earlier about alliances. What's the reality and what's Andy Burnham saying he's going to do about it? I haven't got time to tell you about all the other candidates in the interest of political objectivity. So the first thing in our manifesto is about enabling journeys without cars. Where are we on that? Well, basically, there is a very little appetite in Greater Manchester for disincentivising car use, as far as we can tell. There are plans for more active neighbourhoods, but very little appetite around disincentivising cars. The second one, clean air and green space. Well, we are still implementing our clean air zone, unlike other places that have cancelled them through COVID, but still no private cars in there. Andy Burnham has promised a mysterious green fund in his manifesto, of which there is no details, so perhaps that will create more links to green spaces. We are seeing evidence of greenwashing. Manchester have just come up with a plan for what they call a mobility hub, but it's basically a multi-storey car park. Third ask is for a lot more focus on the school run and our proposal for massive investment in school streets. We've got almost no school streets in Greater Manchester, and the ones that exist are voluntary, but nothing on that from any of the candidates, unfortunately. The fourth point, B network, you'll have heard of. So we want it to be easier to walk and cycle. Chris Boardman is great, but unfortunately, as we know, the councils control the roads, and it's really only Salford in Greater Manchester of the 10 councils that's powering ahead. The others are all in various stages of slowly getting there. And if the B network, 55 miles of B network will be delivered this year. So you can see it's not exactly powering through, but in the manifesto, Boardman has promised 500 miles by 2024, which is an uptick, and the whole thing will be complete by 2030. Fifth one, a people first approach. So you'll hear this a lot. It's in a lot of the policies in Greater Manchester, but it doesn't happen. Not so much in the manifestos here, but we are hoping that side road zebras will, for instance, come in soon this year. Number 6, 0 deaths on our road. So we're asking our mayor candidates to sign up to the Vision Zero approach. Greater Manchester Police has been in all sorts of disarray. It's one of the worst polices in the country. So in Andy Burnham's manifesto, there is a commitment to a road danger reduction plan. No details, but that does bode well. There's been a big disconnect really between the transport people and the police till now. Buses and trams, give them a better ride. Well, at the moment, the bus companies are fighting back against the plan to put them in public control. And in Andy Burnham's manifesto, he promises to follow through on the plans to bring the buses back in. But the big news is plan to pilot bikes and dogs on trams in off-peak, which is one of our campaign goals as Walk Ride, long-held campaign goal. Trains, also a plan from Burnham to bring rail back into GM control, which is really interesting. And ninth ask from us is for an integrated network. All the candidates have said that they'll do that. But the key point that we're asking for is to bring or look at bringing the key roads in as well. We don't see how you can do that without the roads. And interestingly, what Burnham has said is that he's going to rebrand the entire transport network as the B network if he gets back in, which is quite an interesting idea. And then lastly, we want a big focus on governance and more accountability. Lots of people quite alienated by how little their councils let them in. And there is some promising signs on that, but it still hasn't gone far enough yet. So if you want to know more, come to our campaign hustings, which is on Thursday night at 5:30, where Burnham and the Lib Dem and the Green candidate will be answering our questions. Thanks very much.
It was really just, I was thinking like 10 minutes before it started, I should prepare something, and I thought, what the most memorable bits of the past year that's happened in Ideas with Beers. So just the first 10 things that came into my head. And he's on the screen at the moment. He was number one when Mark Strong announced that Madeira Drive had gone in as the first pop-up. That was the first thing that popped into my brain as my kind of number one slot. And gone through him, when Simon Phillips came on from Lambeth and talked about his area-wide traffic management plan to speed up the process of rolling out the emergency infrastructure. That was a great moment. We all had a big round of applause on that. When Phil the Power Jones, as I like to call him, came on and told me how we were going to legally get side road zebras done, that was a big win. That was a big win for me and saved me about a year's worth of thought. So big shout to that. Other ones like I thought Katya's talk on gender and equality was great, and I'd really missed Katya. She'd been away studying hard, so that was an amazing one. These are all the kind of greatest hits that I definitely suggest. Well, my personal favourites anyway. Kate Carpenter, when we had the road safety like a 3-week special, she completely fired me up to do what I thought was my best speech. But I'm going to say Kate was the one there. Claire Stocks herself. When you talked about mass behaviour change across the nation, I thought that talk was absolutely fantastic, and everybody should watch that one. Definitely a good one. Talking of my all-time favourite talk, it's probably got to be Graham Cooper and Shan Wilkinson and the history of low traffic neighbourhoods. Absolutely brilliant stuff. Just recently, Mark Hodson is so good. We've had him on 3 times. I'm probably going to have him on a 4th. It's just been really like opening my eyes to that, just how great the work that the West Midlands Police do. So that's fantastic stuff. And I've got to mention Robert Huxford and David Harris as well. Just their complete history of the world of streets has been pretty phenomenal, and I can't wait for the journey to finish. In fact, I'll be sad if it ever does end. I've been really enjoying that one, and I'm contractually obliged to mention that Chris Borden was pretty good on the Christmas special, as too was John Dales. That's both my bosses covered, and let's move on with the programme. That's kind of all I wanted to say. There I think the unmissable moments. There were plenty more, but they were the first 10 that jumped into my head.
Excellent. What's happening in Cambridge? Let me tell you. I've only got 3 slides, so I'm going to do what's happened in the quick pandemic changes, what are some of the other really big, long-running changes, and what's next. So, right, I came on Ideas with Beers. I think the first thing I presented was our campaign plan for our Spaces to Breathe campaign. So we kicked that off, had over 400 people from all over Cambridge, really representing organizations, political parties and so on, signing our open letter calling for spaces to breathe, so that we had space for social distancing, getting exercise, etc. during the pandemic. And it worked. We got some modal filters, as you can see. We got some amazing press coverage and really started reaching out to new stakeholders who saw us as thought leaders, putting forward great ideas. And of course, we repurposed our CamCycle cargo bike to help with delivery of scrubs and fabric and so on. So very quickly, we saw some stuff happening in Cambridge, but I think we've seen really great details of how other cities and campaigns have worked with modal filters and LTNs, etc. I think Cambridge is probably not the leader in that, perhaps because we had quite a few going already. Really big things that are so exciting for Cambridge. We had our Dutch roundabout open. Woo!
Yeah. Regeneration. That's what's needed now.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, that was strange. Okay. So yes, it was that Dutch roundabout klaxon. The other thing is we had the Abbey Chesterton Bridge lifted in the fog at 2 a.m, which will form a really important link on the Chisholm Trail, which is something that CamCycle has been campaigning for over 20 years. And just 2 weeks ago, we had a tunnel put in 1 week. They destroyed the road, dug it out, put in the tunnel, put the road back on, and it was done 2 times in a week. So we're really looking forward to getting on that bridge and through that tunnel, hopefully by the end of the summer for the Chisholm Trail. And we're now starting to see school streets popping up around Cambridgeshire as well, which is really exciting. Some need some tweaking, but we really are seeing, even in Cambridge, that school streets do get more kids and their parents onto bikes. So what is next? I'm so excited about this because, Roger, I'm doing the things you said we should be doing. Well, CamCycle is doing, so that is brilliant. You said we really needed to sort of tie into that carbon footprint of transport. Well, our big campaign that launches in 2 days is our Zero Carbon Streets campaign. It kicks off with a big fundraising campaign. Hint, hint, if you like what we do. Feel free to donate and have your donation doubled. But this is a campaign where CamCycle is really reaching out beyond Cambridge and into the region and really making that message about having to have very quick transition to sustainable transport. But CamCycle wants to expand, wants to hire another person so that we can really help communities develop those visions, because we just don't have the resources to do that. Roger, we are also influencing the elections. This year, CamCycle has done our biggest ever election survey with 433 candidates across 5 elections. It's going to be insane. And we have contacted nearly all of them to participate. And we're also launching in a few weeks Save Our Cycles campaign, which is all about cycle theft. So watch this space, and when it's ready, we'll probably ask Brian if I can come and present that as well. So that is everything in Cambridge.
In fact, actually, come think of this is a perfect natural LTN. The reason why this is an LTN is because the level crossing was taken out of use and a bridge was put in. That would have been about 2003. So traffic around here is very low. Again, nothing to do with any campaign or anything. It was just, it's Network Rail, as you know. They're far more. If we all have the safety attitude of Network Rail, then we'd all be very safe, as we know. I could do a good and bad. I could.
Got 2 minutes left, James. So just.
Okay, that's fine. But it's just what you're going to hear everywhere else. Bits here, the odd temporary bit here, lots of rubbish elsewhere. So instead, really, I just 1 minute just to go through this photo, why it's so brilliant. Firstly, it's a fun fair. Secondly, you can probably imagine it's been an absolute parking nightmare in the 20 years or so I've lived here. Nobody's done anything about it. Go to councillors, I think it's on a ward boundary as well, no action. And the best quote I've ever had about this was something along the lines of, we don't want to stop people having fun, which of course nobody does. But the problem wasn't that people were going to have fun, it was just that they were parking everywhere, and their fun had to get in the way of everyone else's legitimate fun, commuting or otherwise. For anyone who knows the area, if you see behind, if you see where the big mast is, that's Canley Station, which is basically a suburban station. It's one west of Coventry, still heavily used. So what's happened here? I don't know. But I think a cabinet level decision has been made here. If you can see on the right, you'll see a chain of ropes. This isn't even paint, this isn't even infrastructure, it's just a rope. Now nobody's parking on that verge. And as you'll see, free car park. This is, I know a lot of people that aren't fans of nudge theory, but this is actually nudge theory doing what it's supposed to do. It's telling all the drivers that they can park around the corner for free. and that they don't have to trash the verge and be antisocial with everyone else. However, as we all know, nudge alone isn't enough. I've got about 20 seconds. Nudge alone isn't enough. This works because, believe it or not, for the second time in the 20 years of living here, the wardens have been around issuing tickets for people who still further down the road ignore the signs. So it needs both, but it's fantastic to actually see this. You'll also see right in the bottom, this is from a hire bike. It's probably more a novelty thing, but we do have these now. And that's probably all.
This is the 24th of March 2020. So this is post lockdown, but pre closure of Madeira Drive, and that's where it really all started. But a year ago today, I was the first person to cycle down after they closed the road. Well, I wasn't necessarily, but I was the first person to be photographed cycling down there in the Argus. And in fact, I turned out to be the poster boy for the Argus. Well, I'm just totally pissed off today by not sharing a photo with them because we call them the Cargus locally for obvious reasons. So that was the closure. This is a bit more detailed. The western end of Madeira Drive was closed and turned over to walking and cycling on the 20th of April 2020 formally. Legally on that date. So we think it's the first, although Beth in Bournemouth thinks that they were there first before us. So Brighton went on from that to doing more. At the time we had a Labour administration, lots of people were cycling. This is my son on the left down in Shoreham actually. And this is what was agreed in June when we were still, I think, a Labour controlled administration. The things in yellow are what's been done. The things not in yellow are things that were promised in June last year and haven't been done. So you can see that there was a lot promised that hasn't actually been even delivered or worked on. And I'll try and run through some of the other stuff very, very quickly. The Old Shoreham Road has been very controversial. This was the men putting up the sign for it. I haven't got a photo with the wands for some reason, but this shows you what happened. It was a dual carriageway road. They took out the inside lane. There is still rumblings going on, and we have a lot of people who are against it, including our local Labour MP, who is convinced that it's caused anger and chaos and is going in the media saying such. In fact, he's apparently briefing around Westminster saying that as well. So that's very disappointing. That's the MP for Hove. Meanwhile, there was some footway widenings going on, although people seem to think, not in this photo, but they think that it's a place to park on. We've also had the seafront route along the A259, some very happy people using it. I'll come back to this in a second. We had one route that was taken out. This was at the Palace Pier roundabout, which many of you will know. Unfortunately, you can see what happened there. It did lead to congestion. It led to 45-minute bus tailbacks. We weren't very worried about what happened to the cars, but we were worried what happened to the buses. Meanwhile, due to a process of Labour managing to lose 2 or 3 of its councillors, the Green administration had taken over, and the decision to take this out was actually a Green decision by a very short-lived chair of the committee, Pete West, my friend, who resigned very soon afterwards, basically because he got so much criticism for Bikelash. So we now have a chair, Amy Healy, young Green, who's running the committee really well. So further west on the A259, we've now got a proper wand protected route with with parking on the floating outside, but it's one way in the direction away from the camera and one way towards, so we've got double the width. Unfortunately, trying to persuade people a narrow and a one-way cycle lane. So when you say people cycling the wrong way down one-way streets, well, they cycle the wrong way down one-way cycle lanes as well, but it seems to work fine. Slight segue over to Shoreham, and just a shout out to the people from Shoreham by Cycle. I had to throw in this photo, and thanks to Roger for all the work he's been doing. And this is the sort of people that have been cycling in Shoreham. It's just a few miles away. We've got the Valley Garden scheme, which wasn't strictly a COVID related scheme, but managed to open this year, 4-metre wide cycle track, separated. And again, it's been a game changer in the centre of the city. Not very long, but really made it permeable. And we're just waiting for the next phase to go ahead. I like the poster on the thing, and I'll quickly scroll through our school streets, police parking and cycle lanes. This is what Madeira Drive looks like this morning, and it's wide enough for 2 of these to pass. This is cycling without aid, and it was designed so they could pass in opposite directions, and the old people, not the volunteers in them, could high five as they go past each other. So that's the new definition of the double buggy test. We have the double rickshaw test.
You've got him, mate.
This is slightly different to, I'm sorry, to begin with an apologies. It's not going to be a lot of information about what's been happening on the ground. I think you've heard a lot of that already, particularly in Lambeth. And this is more to do with my reflections as an outsider on the inside, or is it an insider on the outside, in terms of what's been happening in my local neighbourhood and how local people who are perhaps not cycle activists have embraced the low traffic neighbourhood, and why I think it's been absolutely fantastic. And there's so much to learn from the way that they've done that. And it's just really wanted to share with everybody the great activities that that they've been doing. So the first thing is, low traffic neighbourhoods. It's not about the T. It's all about, oh dear, I can't get this to work. It's all about the neighbourhood. It's all about the N. And these guys embraced it right at the beginning and started thinking about the things that we could do in this and came up with all sorts of activities. This wasn't the first one, but it was certainly a good one. It was hiding sweets in the planters all around the place, and we could go around and look for them. This is brilliant because what it did was it gave us an opportunity to go into the local shops within the LTN and say, do you want to be part of this? If we put a tenner behind your counter, will you give kids sweets? You know, they're not going to say no to that. So it was a great way of positively engaging with businesses who otherwise you would not have been part of this and probably been feeling quite grumpy about that. We went on to do something better than that, I thought. I mean, who does not like chocolate? So hiding chocolate in the planters was an absolute winner. So this was massively popular across the piece and enabled all sorts of people to come into the conversation. I have to say, some quite creative and productive people made this happen because they designed all these badges. We hid the badges for children. And we got round, even to branching out to the I Love My LTN badge that people wanted to find in the planters. The reason why I think this was fantastically successful was the provocation it made to those people who allegedly didn't want the LTNs, because it actually brought them into asking what are rather silly questions, I think, like, what are you doing encouraging children to play in the streets around these planters? Surely that's dangerous. And when you think about all the things that we're trying to do in terms of reanimating, reactivating space, that to me, that was the biggest endorsement of that we're being successful in doing this kind of thing. So I suppose my lesson from this was that, what we do as transport professionals is we create the canvas, we create the space, but what's really, really necessary to make it successful is to animate that space. And what these bunch of guys have done is just really own that space and really animate it and really make it work. So I just think it was brilliant, and I had my hats off to all of them. And I was sad that I couldn't contribute anything, and they were leading the way. So that was it, really. Have I got? Sorry.
3 minutes, Bryn, and what a great presentation.
I beg your pardon, I did not show you the other slides, which is basically what they created. And in the end, that was poor presentation skills because I didn't show you the slides.
Send us the slides, Bryn. We can put them up after.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, that would have made it in my top 10 presentations, Bryn. I thought
if I'd have given it.
So yes, Ealing. We did quite well with our funding. We got money for 9 low traffic neighbourhoods and 6 pop-up cycle lane schemes and a dozen school streets, which was fantastic. On the low traffic neighbourhoods, I think we suffered from the rush to put them in, and there wasn't a lot of great communication. In the first few days, they became high traffic neighbourhoods, and I think we've had more problems from that down the line than some other areas. We also had a problem with the council failed to communicate with the London Ambulance Service and initially, and that we had a lot of negative feedback from residents about that, where ambulances stopped at bollards. So the bollards came out after about 4 months on all our LTNs and have been replaced by ANPR cameras. And we also have disabled blue badge holders are allowed to pass through them now in the LTN and where they live. So the good news is that they've been extended by 6 months, so all are still in. I'll move on quickly to our pop-up cycle lanes, and you'll see the problem with the first ones that were put in was drivers dislodging the plates, the base plates, and at night these were a hazard for cyclists. We've heard of a couple of cyclists hitting these and coming off. So the council has sort of upgraded from those cheaper sort of £50 orange and white ones to more robust ones that cost about £100 but do the job, which is great. We have a growing cycle culture, so we can now rock down to Ealing's first e-bike shop. Ealing Broadway Shopping Centre has converted one of their stores into cycle parking, which is fantastic. Our first cycle cafe opened last week, and we've got lots of children travelling by bike all over the LTNs, which is lovely to see. So it's moving in the right direction. Politically, it's still interesting. We've got a march happening on Saturday this week, so we'll find out how much support that gets. That's an opposition march. There was some talk very early on about natural low traffic neighborhoods. So I've thrown this slide in. If you can see 6 down here, Northfields is the largest 2020 LTN. It's about 2 kilometers long from north to south. Lots of people have been saying it's too big, it's too big. But when you look at the low traffic neighborhoods and the circumference that drivers have to drive around, you include the natural ones, it's the 6th largest in Ealing, so it ain't that big. And when we actually started adding up all our LTNs, we discovered about 50 historical LTNs and natural LTNs. So they are out there. And that's me.
So I'm up, yeah. Anniversary, well, it's been a hell of a year, as Roger said, and that's the website to go to for send stuff to. Okay, that's my thought. Going back a year, I remember when the first work was being done, Mark Strong was claiming to be doing the first work in Brighton, and then...
No, I didn't do it, I just was here.
You were just there, yeah. But stuff was happening, and then Lambeth got going with a big thing. I really must emphasize that thing. There was a big thing about working for the common good. It was linking in with a very kind of strange, but a bit scary, but also kind of exciting time. This point about working for the common good, about to build back better. And there's always been this idea that we need to build back better, greener, with less car van domination. Of course, by contrast, you get the dinosaurs at Kensington and Chelsea saying, well, we don't know what's going to happen and there might need to be more cars around and whatever. And what was made clear from central government is the way we have to come out of this has got to be with fewer cars, because we're not going to get so many people on public transport. And therefore we have to support the walking, cycling and staying at home alternatives. And that was a very definite thing which came out from about May onwards. So what's happened? Well, I think it's important to make the links between COVID-19 and transport. That's an important thing to do. Travel spreads the disease and allows variants to emerge. We have to be aware of closing borders. Poor air quality and poor health exacerbate the adverse effects of being infected. So it's very important to remember that in that first wave of enthusiasm, we were all saying it's terribly important to allow people to walk and cycle, and indeed to encourage it. And that did come out, as Roger said, unlike Spain. Again, this point that you see this with people talking about masks saying, well, you know, it's my health. And no, it's not. It's about the common good. And we have to support walking and cycling in order to do this, to genuinely facilitate and not just encourage. So good stuff from central government. The Furness letter from Rupert Furness not on the DFT website, but it has gone out, is in the public domain, and it did have that instruction to highway authorities. Anything that does not meaningfully alter the status quo on the road will not be funded. Quite dramatic. LTN 120, gear change, etc. And also don't forget the urban targets of getting up to 50% of walking and cycling, which we've talked about more recently. Announcement from the Minister, important discussion by Phil Goodwin and others. And earlier on, Prime Minister talking about the golden age of the bicycle. So that's the good stuff from central government. Locally, the good stuff, a lot of support for low traffic neighbourhoods, shown in polls and stated commitment and action from some local politicians, kicking off from Lambeth and maybe Brighton just before. Lots of highway authorities wanted to install measures, almost all of them wanting to install something. Increases in cycling, very obviously, leisure cycling at weekends going up by about 3 or 4 times. Polls suggesting people want to walk and cycle more after lockdown. Some school streets have gone in. Incidentally, they've shown up how pathetic the previous approaches to get people to walk and cycle to school were. Lots of school travel planners with very little to show from 10 or 20 years of activity. School streets have been much more effective when they've gone in. Some good pop-up cycle lanes, wider than previous advisory cycle lanes, gradually getting the right kind of technology, like Martin from Ealing pointed out. The London mayoralty, which is going to go to Mr. Khan, has made it clear he wants to keep LTNs. The opponents will not win. So some good stuff. And also working from home, if that continues in any shape or form, we hope it's done in the right, best possible ways, that will be good for the local transport active travel agenda. And don't forget us, we're here. It's been a cracker of a session and lots of stuff has come out over this last year. It's been terribly important to get the information out. We are getting a bit more professional about it with the activity of Claire and Steve. So let's crack on with getting this good stuff out. Bad stuff from central government, been very slow on getting Active Travel England going. And it's still, if you look at Roger's comments on the chat, it's still going to take some time if it's going to have teeth, and it should have teeth. And so I'm prepared to wait another couple of months to get that teeth, but that will then take us into a period of massive increase in car usage. So that really should have happened 6 months ago at the latest, and it hasn't. We do still need to get that Part 6 out in order to facilitate various measures outside London. It would be nice to have more than just cycle training is good and here's some vouchers for bikes. A really forceful approach on direct support for cycling type schemes could have got things going better. Being bad on the roads program, you know, we can't get away from it. That's not sending out the right message. Also, it would be good with COP26 coming to take on board the advice from the Committee on Climate Change to reduce car usage by at least 9% by 2035, I think it is. So, you know, that needs to be better. On the highway code revision, Roger's said some things about that. We are getting some good stuff going through on the highway code, almost certainly, but we should have got the recommendations on high vis and helmets taken out and replaced by something like consider, because that's better for criminal, for contributory negligence claims, and really would get us away from the diversionary red herrings and victim blaming. So there's that. BBC coverage, yeah, bad on a couple of occasions of low traffic neighborhoods, but at least we got a pile in on that. And should be much more emphasis on the need to plan for a better future, not just, hey, wow, it's nice to see some kids out in the street and more people cycling, just to get the point that we need to do this for climate change, etc. Bad locally, much of the rush for money was ill-conceived. It didn't go, it wasn't thought through properly. Those highway authorities don't want to do the right thing, don't want to do the right thing. So will lead to what I think Mark Treasure raised at the beginning, that the people who were keen to start off with will be getting and doing good stuff, and the people who are bad are going to probably carry on being pretty bad. We've talked about local schemes taken out, most obviously Kensington and Chelsea, where I think the message is that even something which is very popular and well supported and which doesn't remove much highway space for motor vehicles will push back, and we need to push back against the pushback. A lot of people just being scaredy cats like Sutton with a fear of the bike lash. Been a lot of foot dragging, doing the least possible stuff, just sort of trying to get away with some school streets and then not doing them properly and just basically fizzling out. And we could have done with a sort of more robust push, including direct support for cycling, policing, etc., to bring it all together. The lessons I draw, you have to proceed with care, a lot of consultations, correct use of equalities, considerations. We need an overall radical program, recognizing that opposition will be there, as I just said. Avoid the iceberg tips, things, campaigns like, oh, let's stop idling. No, actually, let's get down to the real important stuff. Nigel Havers likes anti-idling campaigns, by the way. Regrettably, we're not Paris, nearly there, Claire, and worried about similar levels of congestion. And what we do now, final slide, it's not this would be nice, but we have to do it. And if people don't want to, what's your alternative? We need to be more entitled about walking and cycling. We were there first. And get a driver entitlement, make the links, bring in stuff about enforcement, deterrent centering, and sentencing, confidence training, the questioning of car culture, bring it all in. And I will need to be doing some presentations here on problems with road safety culture, because that's where a lot of the basic assumptions lie, and we have to get challenging that wage cultural struggle. So finally, well, oh, sorry, just a quick other slide, just rush through. Point out failures and how things link in. I'll just do one final slide. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Remember that.
Hi, thanks everybody, and thanks to see everybody. It's been fantastic. I'll be as quick as I can. So two things. One is I've cycled right throughout lockdown. The very first lockdown, it was fantastic because there was no traffic and I could cycle miles with impunity, and it was safe and it was fantastic and it was marvelous. The biggest mistake that was made for me was that the last lockdown that we had, someone's noise.
Yeah,
there was no restriction on driving. So I did, for example, last Wednesday, I cycled 75 miles through several boroughs, counties, several areas, and the amount of traffic was just unbelievable. And this is a problem. We're not going to get people cycling distances between counties or boroughs, and they can only be 3 miles, 5 miles, which is very short if there's not a restriction on the amount of car use. There's been quite a bit in chat about how, and somebody mentioned about an alliance of groups, and this is something I feel very strongly. I was going to say it last week, but I've kept it to this week. We have London Cycling Campaign, we have Cycling UK, we have living streets, we have 20s Plenty, we have Sustrans, we've got all these separate charities. None of them are funded or properly, they're all charities. We need one alliance. I heard about something called the Walking and Cycling Alliance last week, never heard of it before. Ruth Cadbury mentioned it, I didn't know about it. We need one alliance so that we can unite people who walk and cycle, so there isn't this kind of us and them sort of thing. But having said all that, it's when you are on a bike, you can get to see distances much better and you can see what's wrong with the road. So every traffic engineer must have to cycle so that they can judge where zebra crossings need to be, where people are walking, need safe ways. There's such terrible stuff out there. Simon Monk always has a go at me, but I'm going to say it. There is such terrible stuff out there. The Tolworth roundabout, there's a cycle lane to get to it. Going round the roundabout, you are on the equivalent of the M25. Klaxon coming, yes, I know. So what we need is bigger aspiration. We've got C9, which is fabulous. Whenever any of you come to London, get on it. TfL, however, Kew Bridge, you're stranded. You wouldn't take a family across there. You wouldn't take a disabled person across there. We've got to have joined up thinking. Joined up thinking. Thank you. Love you all. Great time. Lovely to see you all.